The sky tore open with fire. Through the smoke and ash, her silhouette emerged, a figure both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. Her silver skin glimmered like liquid mercury under the cold light of the twin moons. She wasn't supposed to come back. She wasn't supposed to feel anything. But as her violet eyes scanned the desolate landscape, one thought burned through her mind. He was still here. For those of you who are drawn to stories of love, betrayal, and impossible choices, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell me what you'd do in her place. And now, let's uncover the truth. The Earth she'd left behind had changed. The humans had rebuilt after the invasion, but they hadn't forgiven. Her kind, the Ceylan, had retreated to the farthest edges of the galaxy after their failed conquest, leaving behind ruins and scars. Yet despite the lingering hatred between their species, she had returned, defying her people's laws and her own instincts of survival. When Ayla landed, the memories hit her harder than the planet's gravity. The first time she'd met him, she'd been a scout gathering intel before the war. Back then, she had no idea what love was. Her people didn't feel it, or so they claimed. But meeting Ethan, watching his stubborn humanity in the face of overwhelming odds, had changed something fundamental within her. She'd betrayed her mission, her people, everything she knew, for the fragile hope of a connection that wasn't supposed to exist. But Ethan didn't know she was coming. He didn't even know she was alive. Ayla's ship had barely cloaked itself before the sensors flared red. Human drones buzzed through the air, scanning for any sign of Ceylan intruders. She moved swiftly, her movements almost a blur as she navigated the ruins of what had once been a great city. Every step brought her closer to where she thought Ethan would be, closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Why hadn't he left Earth? Why hadn't he sought her out? Had he forgotten her, or worse, moved on? The compound loomed ahead, surrounded by electric fences and armed guards. The humans had fortified themselves against her kind, their fear still palpable years after the war had ended. She hesitated at the perimeter, her enhanced vision catching glimpses of faces in the dim light. None of them were his. The first sign of trouble came when the alarms blared. Her ship's cloaking device faltered, and the drones swarmed like angry wasps. She had seconds to decide: run and risk losing him forever, or fight and reveal herself to a species that would likely kill her on sight. She chose to fight. Energy bolts lit up the night as she darted between the drones, her agility and Ceylan tech giving her the upper hand. But the humans had learned. Their weapons were sharper, faster, and more precise. A bolt grazed her arm, searing her silver skin and filling the air with the acrid smell of burned flesh. Pain was a distraction she couldn't afford. She broke through the line, disappearing into the shadows of the city. The human guards pursued, but she knew this terrain better than they did. Every alley and collapsed building became a tool for her escape. By the time she reached the underground safe house where Ethan had once taken her, she was bleeding, exhausted, and trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. The safe house door creaked open, the air inside stale and untouched for years. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe a message, a trace of him, something to prove he'd been here. Instead, she found herself staring at a photo tucked into the corner of a broken mirror. It was of him, smiling, with a woman by his side. Her heart, or whatever the Ceylan equivalent was, felt like it had shattered into a million pieces. Was she too late? Had she risked everything for a love that had already faded into the past? But as she traced her fingers over the edges of the photo, her enhanced senses picked up faint footsteps approaching. Someone was here. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the dilapidated safe house like the pounding of a war drum. Ayla's heart raced, her breath shallow as she pressed herself against the cold, crumbling wall. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to flee, but something deeper, a primal, unyielding need, kept her rooted to the spot. She flexed her fingers, ready to defend herself if necessary, though the injury on her arm throbbed with every slight movement. The figure emerged into the dim light, and Ayla's sharp intake of breath betrayed her. It wasn't Ethan. It was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in the worn but unmistakable uniform of the Earth Resistance. His weapon was already drawn, a sleek plasma rifle that hummed with lethal energy. His gaze darted around the room, sharp and suspicious, until it landed on her. "Don't move!" he barked, his voice harsh and commanding. Ayla raised her hands slowly, careful not to provoke him. She had the technology and the skill to disarm him, but not without risking a fatal escalation. "I'm not here to harm anyone," she said, her voice soft yet steady. The man's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the rifle. "A Selan. Here. Why?" She chose her words carefully, knowing the wrong answer could end her life. "I'm looking for someone, a human. His name is Ethan." The mention of Ethan's name seemed to strike a chord. The man's stance shifted, his expression flickering with something that resembled recognition. Or was it suspicion? He took a step closer, the barrel of his rifle still trained on her. "You're lying. Why would someone like you be looking for him?" Ayla hesitated, her mind racing. The truth was dangerous, but lies would only make things worse. "We knew each other. Before the war." The man let out a bitter laugh. "You expect me to believe that? Ethan doesn't have Selan friends." Before she could respond, the distant whine of drones filled the air. The resistance soldier cursed under his breath, his gaze snapping toward the boarded-up windows. "They're tracking you. You led them here." "I didn't mean to," she said quickly. "I can help." "Don't bother," he snapped. "Just stay out of my way." He moved toward the door, his weapon at the ready, but Ayla couldn't let him leave. If he knew Ethan, he was her only lead. "Wait," she said, her tone firmer now. "Please, if you know where Ethan is, tell me." The man paused, his shoulders tense. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw the weariness in his eyes, the kind of exhaustion that came from years of fighting a losing battle. "Ethan's gone," he said flatly. The words hit her like a physical blow. "Gone? What do you mean?" "He left Earth, took a transport to one of the outer colonies years ago. After everything that happened." The man shook his head. He wanted a fresh start. Can't say I blame him. Ayla's mind reeled. She'd come all this way, risked everything, only to find that he wasn't even here. But before despair could fully take hold, a spark of hope ignited within her. If he was alive, if he was out there somewhere, she could still find him. "Which colony?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, then sighed. "Trident 4. But if you're smart, you'll stay far away from him. He doesn't need your kind bringing more trouble into his life." The whine of the drones grew louder, closer. The soldier glanced toward the door again, then back at her. "You'd better get moving. If they find you here, neither of us will survive." Ayla didn't argue. She slipped out through a back entrance, her mind already calculating the fastest way to reach Trident 4. The resistant soldier's words lingered in her mind, though. What kind of trouble had Ethan faced after the war? And why had he left Earth without trying to find her? As she navigated the dark streets, the memories came flooding back. She'd met Ethan during one of her reconnaissance missions, disguised as a human to gather intel. He'd been a mechanic, stubbornly working to keep a small group of survivors alive despite the odds stacked against them. She'd been drawn to his resilience, his unwavering determination. And though she'd tried to suppress it, she'd felt something. A connection that defied logic, defied everything she'd been taught about humans and Salans being incompatible on every level. Their time together had been brief, stolen moments in the midst of chaos. When the war escalated, she'd been forced to choose between him and her people. In the end, she'd chosen him. But her betrayal had come at a cost. She'd been captured by the Selan High Command, subjected to interrogation and exile. By the time she escaped and returned to Earth, Ethan was gone. Now, as she made her way to a hidden launch site where she could secure transport off-world, one question burned brighter than all the others. Would Ethan even want to see her again? The launch site was heavily guarded, but Ayla's Cellin technology gave her the edge she needed. She slipped past the patrols, her silver skin shifting to blend seamlessly with the shadows. The ship she found was old, but functional, its systems easy enough to hack. As she plotted a course for Trident 4, a mix of fear and anticipation churned within her. She had no idea what she would find when she got there. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving until she saw Ethan again. The journey to Trident 4 was long and treacherous, the kind of voyage most beings avoided unless they had no other choice. The colony orbited a dying star, its surface battered by relentless solar flares and shrouded in toxic storms. It wasn't the kind of place someone went to start over. Yet, as Ayla stared out at the swirling void of space, she couldn't shake the image of Ethan, his face etched into her memory like a scar. He had always sought peace, a quiet life far removed from the violence that consumed their world. What could have driven him to a place like Trident 4? The ship's autopilot chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. They were entering the colony's orbit, and even from a distance, the sight was foreboding. Trident 4's domed cities glimmered faintly beneath the roiling clouds, their lights barely visible through the thick, amber haze of the atmosphere. The closer she got, the more her ship's sensors began to blare warnings, high radiation levels, unstable weather patterns, and signs of civil unrest within the colony itself. Ayla cloaked the ship, guiding it toward the outskirts of the main settlement. She couldn't risk detection, not with the fragile peace between humans and Cellin still hanging by a thread. Landing in a remote sector, she disembarked into the stifling heat, her boots sinking into the cracked, sulfuric ground. The air was thin, the kind that clawed at your lungs with every breath. She activated her biofilter, a soft hum filling her ears, as her suit adjusted to the hostile environment. The settlement loomed ahead, a sprawling maze of interconnected domes and ramshackle buildings cobbled together from salvaged materials. It was a place of desperation, where survival came at a steep cost. As she approached, she saw the people, humans, and a smattering of other species, moving through the dusty streets like shadows. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. Trident 4 wasn't a home, it was a prison. Ayla kept her hood low, her silvery features hidden beneath layers of fabric. Her presence here was dangerous enough. If anyone discovered what she truly was, it would only take one panicked voice to turn the entire colony against her. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her enhanced senses scanning for any sign of Ethan. The first lead came from a grizzled bartender in a dimly lit cantina. His voice was rough, his gaze sharp, as he sized her up. "Ethan," he repeated, leaning on the counter. "Yeah, I know him. Not many folks here don't. He's the one who keeps the lights on in this dump." Her chest tightened. "He's alive, then?" The bartender frowned. "For now. But if I were you, I wouldn't go looking for him. Ethan's got enough trouble on his plate without strangers showing up unannounced." "What kind of trouble?" The man shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "You'll see soon enough. If you're smart, you'll keep your distance." Ayla ignored the warning, her resolve hardening. She pried the location of Ethan's workshop from the bartender and set off into the heart of the settlement. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. What kind of life had Ethan built here? And what kind of trouble had followed him across the galaxy? When she reached the workshop, it was a far cry from the place she remembered. The building was little more than a dilapidated shell, its walls streaked with rust and grime. The faint hum of machinery echoed from within, accompanied by the occasional burst of sparks. Ayla hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the door's control panel. The memories came flooding back again, the nights they'd spent in his old workshop on Earth, their whispered conversations beneath the stars, the warmth of his touch against her cold skin. She'd told herself she was prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't so sure. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the panel. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a cluttered interior bathed in the flickering light of holoscreens and repair drones. And there he was. Ethan. He was hunched over a workbench, his back to her, oblivious to her presence. His hair was longer, streaked with grey, and his shoulders sagged with the weight of years. But it was him. She stepped inside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan." He froze, the tool in his hand clattering to the floor. Slowly, he turned, and their eyes met for the first time in years. The moment stretched, electric and unbearable, as 1,000 emotions passed between them. "You," he said finally, his voice rough with disbelief. "It's me," she replied, her throat tight. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, just as she began to take a step forward, Ethan's expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" The coldness in his voice cut deeper than any weapon. "I came to find you," she said, struggling to keep her composure. "I thought—" "You thought what?" he interrupted, his tone sharp. "That you could just show up after all this time and everything would be fine?" His words hit her like a blow, but she refused to back down. "I had no choice, Ethan. After the war, I was captured. I couldn't come back. And now you can." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You shouldn't have come, Ayla. You don't know what you've done." She frowned, stepping closer. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by shouts and the unmistakable whine of approaching hovercrafts. Ethan's expression darkened, and he grabbed her arm. "They've found you," he said grimly, "and now they'll come for both of us." The deafening roar of hovercraft engines reverberated through the air, shaking the walls of Ethan's workshop. Ayla felt her heart lurch as a blinding spotlight swept across the building, bathing it in a harsh, artificial glow. Ethan didn't hesitate. His grip on her arm tightened as he dragged her toward the back of the workshop. "This way," he said, his voice clipped and urgent. "We don't have much time." She stumbled after him, her mind racing. "Who's after you? What's going on?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, his focus locked on a hidden panel in the wall. With a few deft movements, he pried it open, revealing a narrow passageway that disappeared into the darkness. "Get in," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Ayla hesitated for a fraction of a second before ducking inside. The passage was cramped, its walls lined with exposed cables and pipes that hummed faintly with energy. Ethan followed close behind, sealing the panel shut just as the sound of boots thundered outside the workshop. "Ethan Ross," a voice boomed from outside, distorted by an amplifier. "We know you're in there. Surrender now, and we might let you live." Ethan's jaw tightened as he led Ayla deeper into the passage, the faint light from his wrist beacon casting long, flickering shadows. "They're bounty hunters," he explained at last, his voice low but tense. "Hired by the colony's governor. He wants me out of the picture." Ayla frowned, her mind grappling with the implications. "Why? What did you do?" "I made the mistake of standing up to him," Ethan said bitterly. "Trident 4 is supposed to be a haven, but it's a hellhole run by a tyrant. I've been helping people escape, smuggling them off-world to safer colonies. The governor didn't take kindly to that." Ayla processed his words, her heart heavy. Ethan hadn't just survived. He'd been fighting, risking everything to help others. It was exactly the kind of man he was, and it only made her regret all the more that she hadn't been there for him. "And now I've brought them to you," she said quietly, guilt twisting in her chest. Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening for the briefest moment. "This isn't your fault. They've been after me for weeks. You just gave them an excuse to move faster." The passage opened into a larger chamber, dimly lit and filled with makeshift equipment. It looked like a hideout, complete with survival supplies and a communication console. Ethan began working quickly, activating the console and typing in commands. "I have a ship hidden on the outskirts of the colony," he said. "We can make a run for it, but we'll have to move fast. They'll figure out where we're headed soon enough." Ayla stepped closer, her eyes scanning the console's readout. "What about the people you're helping? Won't they need you?" Ethan paused, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I'll have to trust that they'll make it without me. Right now, the priority is getting you out of here alive." Before she could respond, the console beeped, and a distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "Ross, you've got 10 seconds to come out, or we're blowing the place to pieces, starting now." Ethan swore under his breath and grabbed a small device from the console, a detonator. He handed it to Ayla, his expression grim. "There's an escape tunnel beneath this room. It'll take you outside the perimeter. Use this to seal it behind you." Her eyes widened. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off," he said, already moving toward a storage crate filled with weapons. "It's me they want. You'll have a better chance if I keep them distracted." "No," Ayla said firmly, stepping in front of him. "I didn't come all this way to lose you again." Ethan stared at her, and for a moment, the weight of their shared history hung heavy between them. Then, without warning, he grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm, but not unkind. "Ayla, listen to me. I can't protect you if you stay. If they catch you, they'll kill you, or worse." "I'm not leaving without you," she insisted, her voice breaking. Ethan's expression softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing across his face. Before he could respond, a deafening explosion rocked the chamber, sending a cascade of debris raining down around them. The bounty hunters had breached the workshop. "Go!" Ethan shouted, shoving her toward the escape hatch. Ayla's instincts screamed at her to stay, to fight alongside him, but the look in his eyes left no room for argument. She activated the hatch and dropped into the tunnel below, the sound of gunfire and shouting fading as she descended into the darkness. The tunnel was long and winding, its walls slick with condensation. Ayla moved as quickly as she could, her mind racing with fear and desperation. She clutched the detonator tightly, knowing that activating it would seal the tunnel and any chance of returning to Ethan. When she reached the tunnel's exit, she hesitated. The night sky stretched out before her, the colony's lights flickering in the distance. But she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. Ayla activated her wrist communicator, patching into the signal from Ethan's hideout. Static crackled in her ears before his voice came through, strained, but determined. "They're in," he said. "I'm leading them away from the escape route. You'll be safe." "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't do this without you." His reply was soft, almost inaudible over the chaos. "You'll have to." The line went dead. Ayla stared at the detonator in her hand, her chest tight with grief and rage. She pressed the button, sealing the tunnel behind her. But as the explosion echoed through the night, she made a vow. She wasn't going to lose him. Not again. The dust from the sealed tunnel settled behind her, but Ayla didn't move. Her hands clenched into fists, her pulse pounding in her ears. Ethan was still in there, facing impossible odds, and every fiber of her being screamed to go back. Yet the cold, rational part of her mind knew that returning now would only doom them both. Above her, Trident 4's skies churned with swirling amber clouds, lit sporadically by the bursts of distant lightning. The toxic air clawed at her biofilter, a reminder of the hostile world surrounding her. But Ayla's focus remained unyielding. If there was any chance to save Ethan, she had to act now. She activated her wrist communicator again, patching into the colony's local frequency grid. Static hissed for a moment before she caught fragments of the bounty hunter's transmissions. Target confirmed inside. Seal off perimeter. Authorization to terminate granted. Ayla's heart twisted. Ethan wasn't just a fugitive. They intended to kill him. Her mind raced, piecing together a plan. She needed leverage, a way to turn the tables on the governor and his hired guns. Her gaze fell to the distant glow of the central dome, where the governor's headquarters loomed. If Ethan's defiance had made him an enemy, it meant he'd disrupted something critical to the governor's power. Ayla had to find out what, and fast. The journey to the central dome was perilous. Skirting the edges of the colony, Ayla moved like a shadow, her enhanced senses guiding her through back alleys and abandoned structures. The streets were quieter now, most of the colony's inhabitants taking shelter from the impending storm. Only the occasional patrol droid hummed past, its sensor beam sweeping the darkness. As she approached the dome, the scale of its defenses became apparent. Automated turrets lined the perimeter, and high above, surveillance drones hovered like predatory birds. Ayla studied the layout carefully, her mind calculating angles and blind spots. She spotted a maintenance access point near the base of the dome, a narrow conduit too small for most humans, but just wide enough for her slender frame. With a quick glance to ensure she wasn't being watched, she slipped inside. The conduit was cramped and suffocating, the sound of her own breathing amplified in the enclosed space. She crawled forward, her biofilter working overtime to counteract the stale, chemical-laden air. After what felt like an eternity, the conduit opened into a ventilation shaft overlooking the governor's main control room. From her vantage point, Ayla could see the man himself. A tall, imposing figure with sharp features and an air of smug authority. He stood at the center of the room, flanked by armed guards and hollow displays projecting various colony metrics. But what caught her attention was the transmission he was reviewing. The screen showed a detailed map of Trident 4, overlaid with glowing markers indicating subterranean mining operations. Ayla's eyes narrowed as she realized the truth. The colony wasn't just a refuge for the desperate, it was a resource extraction site, its inhabitants little more than expendable labor. Her stomach churned with anger. Ethan's efforts to help people escape weren't just an act of defiance. They threatened the governor's profits, and now, because of her, he was paying the price. Ayla's focus sharpened as she scanned the control room for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on a secured terminal near the governor, its interface glowing with encrypted files. If she could access it, she might find something to expose his operations, a bargaining chip to force his hand. The challenge would be getting there unnoticed. The room was heavily guarded, and the slightest misstep would alert the entire compound. But Ayla wasn't without her own advantages. She reached into the pouch on her belt, retrieving a small spherical device, a Cellen stealth emitter. Activating it, she felt the familiar shimmer of cloaking energy envelop her body. The world around her blurred slightly, her form rendered invisible to the naked eye. Moving with practiced precision, she descended from the ventilation shaft and slipped into the control room. The guards remained oblivious as she navigated the space, her movements silent and deliberate. Reaching the terminal, she connected her wrist communicator to the interface, bypassing the first layer of encryption. The files were vast, but one immediately caught her attention, a transmission log detailing communications between the governor and an off-world syndicate. As the data streamed onto her device, her breath caught. The logs confirmed her suspicions. The governor had struck a deal with the syndicate to strip Trident 4 of its resources, promising exclusive rights in exchange for military support to suppress any resistance. Ethan's name appeared repeatedly in the files, flagged as a high-value target due to his role in disrupting the operations. Ayla's anger boiled over. The people of Trident 4 weren't just victims of circumstance. They were prisoners, exploited and discarded by a man who saw them as tools. And Ethan had been fighting this battle alone for years. A sudden noise snapped her back to the present. The governor turned, his eyes narrowing as he addressed his guards. "We've wasted enough time on Ross. Deploy the drones. I want him neutralized before dawn." Panic surged through Ayla. She couldn't wait any longer. With the data secured, she slipped back toward the ventilation shaft, her heart pounding. As she climbed back into the ducts, the stealth emitter's charge began to wane, its protective shimmer flickering erratically. She moved quickly, retracing her path out of the dome, but as she emerged into the storm-ravaged night, her communicator buzzed with an incoming message. It was garbled, faint, but unmistakably Ethan's voice. "Ayla, if you can hear this, don't come back. It's too late." Her grip tightened on the device, determination flaring anew. "It's not too late," she whispered, her voice resolute. "Not for you, not for them." With the data in hand and time running out, Ayla made her way back toward the heart of the settlement. The storm raged around her, lightning illuminating the path ahead as she prepared to make her next move. She wasn't going to let Ethan's fight end here, not while she still had the power to change the game. The storm battered the colony with relentless fury, rain slicing through the air like shards of glass, lightning illuminating the skeletal remains of buildings and the desolation they contained. Ayla moved swiftly through the chaos, her every step deliberate, her every thought focused on Ethan. The data she'd stolen burned a hole in her mind, proof of the governor's exploitation, the kind of leverage she could use to turn the tide. But for now, it was only a weapon waiting to be unleashed, and her priority was Ethan. Through the darkness, she traced her way back to the workshop district. The faint echoes of distant gunfire and explosions reached her ears, signaling that Ethan's desperate fight against the bounty hunters was still ongoing. She felt the weight of the detonator she'd used to seal the escape tunnel, a cruel reminder of the choice she'd made to leave him behind. Yet guilt was a luxury she couldn't afford now. As she approached the perimeter of the area, her wrist communicator flared to life with a burst of static, and then Ethan's voice, weak but unmistakable, broke through. "Ayla, stay away. They've got reinforcements coming." "Not without you," she muttered under her breath, adjusting the communicator to track his location. The signal was faint but traceable, leading her toward a heavily damaged sector, where the fighting had clearly intensified. The bounty hunters' hovercrafts loomed in the distance, their searchlights carving through the haze of rain and smoke. Ayla ducked behind a collapsed structure, her sharp eyes scanning the area. Several armed mercenaries patrolled the ruins, their movements precise and methodical, while drones hovered overhead, scanning for heat signatures. Ayla's training as a Salon warrior kicked in. She assessed the terrain, noting the cover provided by the debris and the blind spots in the hunters' patrol patterns. Drawing a small blade from her belt, she advanced silently, slipping past the guards with practiced ease. She found Ethan crouched behind a makeshift barricade, his face pale and streaked with grime. Blood seeped from a wound on his shoulder, staining the torn fabric of his jacket. Despite his injuries, he was still fighting, his blaster rifle clutched tightly in his hands as he fired at the encroaching mercenaries. "Ethan!" Ayla hissed, dropping to his side. His eyes widened in shock and anger. "What are you doing here? I told you to leave! And I told you I'm not leaving without you!" She shot back, her tone leaving no room for argument. She examined his wound quickly, wincing at the severity of it. "You're hurt. We need to get out of here now." Ethan grimaced, his strength waning. "There's no way out. They've got us pinned." "Not for long," Ayla said, pulling the stolen data drive from her belt. "I've got something they can't ignore." Ethan's gaze flicked to the device, his brow furrowing. "What is that?" "Leverage," she replied. "Proof of the governor's deal with the syndicate. If we broadcast this, it'll turn the colony against him and force the hunters to back off." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "That's a death sentence, Ayla. The governor won't let us walk away if we expose him." "Then we make sure he can't stop us," she said firmly. "But first, we need to get you out of here." Ayla activated her communicator, uploading the data to a secure channel. As she worked, the bounty hunters began closing in, their weapons trained on the barricade. Ayla's heart pounded as she calculated their next move. "Get ready," she whispered to Ethan, handing him a second blaster. "We're not going down without a fight." The first mercenary rounded the corner, his weapon raised. Ayla moved like lightning, disarming him with a swift strike before delivering a knockout blow. Ethan, despite his injuries, covered her, taking out another hunter with a precise shot. But their resistance only drew more attention. The drones descended, their mounted turrets firing bursts of plasma that scorched the ground around them. Ayla grabbed Ethan, pulling him into a narrow alley as the barrage intensified. "We can't keep this up," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "We won't have to," Ayla replied, her communicator beeping with confirmation. The data upload was complete, and the transmission was live. The governor's secrets were now exposed, accessible to anyone with a link to the colony's network. Moments later, the hunters' comms crackled with frantic chatter. "We've got a situation. Unauthorized broadcast from Sector 7. Governor's orders. Pull back and secure HQ." Ayla allowed herself a grim smile as the hunters began retreating, their focus shifting to the fallout of the leaked data. She turned to Ethan, her expression softening. "Looks like they've got bigger problems now." Ethan nodded, his exhaustion evident. "You just painted a target on both of us." "Worth it," she said, helping him to his feet. "Now let's get out of here." They moved carefully through the ruins, avoiding the remnants of the hunters' patrols. The storm had begun to subside, leaving the air heavy with the smell of scorched metal and rain-soaked earth. As they reached the edge of the settlement, Ayla activated her emergency beacon, signaling her ship's autopilot to meet them. Ethan leaned heavily on her, his strength fading, but his resolve unbroken. "Ayla," he said quietly, his voice tinged with both gratitude and regret. "You didn't have to come back for me." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Yes, I did. I left you once, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm not making that mistake again." Ethan held her gaze, the unspoken emotions between them stronger than any words. As the lights of her ship appeared on the horizon, cutting through the darkness, Ayla felt a flicker of hope. Their fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in years, they faced it together. The ship's ramp lowered with a hiss, its landing lights casting long, flickering shadows across the ravaged settlement. Ayla guided Ethan aboard, her arm steadying his weight as his injuries slowed his steps. The interior was dimly lit, the hum of the engines vibrating through the metallic walls, a comforting reminder of safety, however fleeting it might be. She eased him into the medbay's chair, her movements quick but gentle. Ethan groaned softly as he leaned back, his face pale but determined. Ayla activated the auto-med unit, the system scanning his injuries before deploying a series of small robotic arms to clean and seal the wound on his shoulder. "Don't move," she instructed, her voice firm but laced with concern. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan muttered, his smirk faint but present. Ayla couldn't help the flicker of a smile that tugged at her lips, but it faded quickly as she turned her attention to the ship's control panel. The data upload had bought them time, but the governor wouldn't let them go easily. She pulled up a holographic map of Trident 4's orbital space, her eyes scanning for escape routes. As she worked, Ethan's voice broke the silence. "What happens now, Ayla? That transmission? It's going to turn the whole colony against him, but he's not going to just roll over. He'll fight back. Hard." "That's why we're leaving," Ayla said, her tone resolute. "For now. You need time to recover, and I need to figure out our next move. But I promise you, Ethan, we're not running forever." He watched her closely, his expression softening. "You've changed." She paused, her hands hovering over the console. "Have I?" "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet. "The Ayla I knew, she wouldn't have come back. She was too focused on her mission, too afraid of letting anyone get close." Ayla looked away, her jaw tightening. "The Ayla you knew was a coward. She walked away from the only thing that mattered, because she thought it was the easier path. But I've learned the hard way that some things are worth fighting for, even if it scares you." Ethan's gaze didn't waver, and when she finally met his eyes, she saw the same unshakable determination that had drawn her to him all those years ago. The moment was interrupted by a warning chime from the console. Ayla's heart sank as she saw the cause. Multiple ships breaking orbit, their trajectories converging on her position. The governor wasn't wasting any time. "We've got incoming," she said, her fingers flying over the controls to prepare for takeoff. Ethan shifted in his seat, his strength visibly returning despite the lingering pain. "How many?" "3. No, 4 interceptors, armed and fast," Ayla replied. "We're not outfitted for a firefight like this." Ethan grinned weakly. "Then I hope you've gotten better at flying." Ayla shot him a wry look. You're about to find out. The ship's engines roared to life as it lifted off, the landing gear retracting with a metallic clunk. Ayla guided it upward, the storm-tossed sky giving way to the cold expanse of space. But the interceptors were closing fast, their sleek forms appearing as blips on her radar. Ayla banked hard to the left, the ship's thrusters flaring as she evaded the first volley of plasma fire. The cabin shuddered violently, the shields absorbing the brunt of the attack but weakening with each hit. "Shields at 40%, Ethan warned, his voice steady despite the urgency. "I noticed," Ayla shot back, her focus razor-sharp as she maneuvered through the chaos. She activated the ship's limited countermeasures, deploying a series of decoy drones to draw the enemy fire. The move bought them a few precious seconds, but it wasn't enough. The interceptors were relentless, their weapons tearing through the decoys and zeroing back in on Ayla's ship. "We can't keep this up," Ethan said, gripping the armrest of his chair. "They'll tear us apart before we can jump." Ayla gritted her teeth, her mind racing. The ship's jump drive was charging, but it needed more time they didn't have. Unless... "There's a debris field just ahead," she said, pointing to the holographic map. "If we can lose them in there, we might have a chance." Ethan's eyes widened. "That's not a debris field. It's a graveyard. Dozens of ships got ripped apart in that sector during the rebellion. It's a death trap." "Exactly," Ayla said, her voice cold with resolve. "They won't expect us to go in." Without waiting for his agreement, she angled the ship toward the field. The remnants of long-forgotten battles loomed ahead, twisted metal and shattered hulls spinning silently in the void. Ayla navigated with precision, weaving through the wreckage as the interceptors pursued. The enemy ships hesitated, their pilots clearly wary of the dense field. Ayla seized the opportunity, diving deeper into the maze of debris. Her fingers danced over the controls, pushing the ship to its limits as she narrowly avoided collisions. Behind them, the interceptors faltered, one of them clipping a jagged piece of wreckage and exploding in a fiery burst. The remaining three adjusted their approach, but their hesitation gave Ayla the opening she needed. The jump drive pinged, fully charged. "Hold on," she warned, her hand slamming down on the activation lever. The ship lurched forward as the stars blurred into streaks of light, the interceptors vanishing from the radar. They had made it. Ayla let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the controls as the ship stabilized in the quiet safety of hyperspace. Ethan slumped back in his seat, a weary smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad," he said, his tone light despite the exhaustion in his voice. "Thanks," Ayla replied, her own relief tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. "But this is just the beginning." Ethan nodded, his expression turning serious. "The governor won't stop. Not after what you've done." "Let him come," Ayla said, her gaze hardening. "This time, we fight together." The ship's engines hummed softly as they hurtled through hyperspace, two souls bound by a shared purpose and an unshakable resolve to stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. The ship's ramp lowered with a hiss, its landing lights casting long, flickering shadows across the ravaged settlement. Ayla guided Ethan aboard, her arm steadying his weight as his injuries slowed his steps. The interior was dimly lit, the hum of the engines vibrating through the metallic walls, a comforting reminder of safety, however fleeting it might be. She eased him into the medbay's chair, her movements quick but gentle. Ethan groaned softly as he leaned back, his face pale but determined. Ayla activated the auto-med unit, the system scanning his injuries before deploying a series of small robotic arms to clean and seal the wound on his shoulder. "Don't move," she instructed, her voice firm but laced with concern. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan muttered, his smirk faint but present. Ayla couldn't help the flicker of a smile that tugged at her lips, but it faded quickly as she turned her attention to the ship's control panel. The data upload had bought them time, but the governor wouldn't let them go easily. She pulled up a holographic map of Trident 4's orbital space, her eyes scanning for escape routes. As she worked, Ethan's voice broke the silence. "What happens now, Ayla? That transmission, it's going to turn the whole colony against him, but he's not going to just roll over. He'll fight back, hard." That's why we're leaving, Ayla said, her tone resolute. For now. You need time to recover, and I need to figure out our next move. But I promise you, Ethan, we're not running forever. He watched her closely, his expression softening. You've changed. She paused, her hands hovering over the console. Have I? Yeah, he said, his voice quiet. The Ayla I knew. She wouldn't have come back. She was too focused on her mission, too afraid of letting anyone get close. Ayla looked away, her jaw tightening. The Ayla you knew was a coward. She walked away from the only thing that mattered because she thought it was the easier path. But I've learned the hard way that some things are worth fighting for, even if it scares you. Ethan's gaze didn't waver, and when she finally met his eyes, she saw the same unshakable determination that had drawn her to him all those years ago. The moment was interrupted by a warning chime from the console. Ayla's heart sank as she saw the cause. Multiple ships breaking orbit, their trajectories converging on her position. The governor wasn't wasting any time. We've got incoming, she said, her fingers flying over the controls to prepare for takeoff. Ethan shifted in his seat, his strength visibly returning despite the lingering pain. How many? 4 interceptors. Armed and fast, Ayla replied. We're not outfitted for a firefight like this. Ethan grinned weakly. Then I hope you've gotten better at flying. Ayla shot him a wry look. You're about to find out. The ship's engines roared to life as it lifted off, the landing gear retracting with a metallic clunk. Ayla guided it upward, the storm-tossed sky giving way to the cold expanse of space. But the interceptors were closing fast, their sleek forms appearing as blips on her radar. Ayla banked hard to the left, the ship's thrusters flaring as she evaded the first volley of plasma fire. The cabin shuddered violently, the shields absorbing the brunt of the attack but weakening with each hit. Shields at 40%, Ethan warned, his voice steady despite the urgency. I noticed, Ayla shot back, her focus razor-sharp as she maneuvered through the chaos. She activated the ship's limited countermeasures, deploying a series of decoy drones to draw the enemy fire. The move bought them a few precious seconds, but it wasn't enough. The interceptors were relentless, their weapons tearing through the decoys and zeroing back in on Ayla's ship. We can't keep this up, Ethan said, gripping the armrest of his chair. They'll tear us apart before we can jump. Ayla gritted her teeth, her mind racing. The ship's jump drive was charging, but it needed more time they didn't have. Unless... There's a debris field just ahead, she said, pointing to the holographic map. If we can lose them in there, we might have a chance. Ethan's eyes widened. That's not a debris field. It's a graveyard. Dozens of ships got ripped apart in that sector during the rebellion. It's a death trap. Exactly, Ayla said, her voice cold with resolve. They won't expect us to go in. Without waiting for his agreement, she angled the ship toward the field. The remnants of long-forgotten battles loomed ahead, twisted metal and shattered hulls spinning silently in the void. Ayla navigated with precision, weaving through the wreckage as the interceptors pursued. The enemy ships hesitated, their pilots clearly wary of the dense field. Ayla seized the opportunity, diving deeper into the maze of debris. Her fingers danced over the controls, pushing the ship to its limits as she narrowly avoided collisions. Behind them, the interceptors faltered, one of them clipping a jagged piece of wreckage and exploding in a fiery burst. The remaining 3 adjusted their approach, but their hesitation gave Ayla the opening she needed. The jump drive pinged, fully charged. Hold on, she warned, her hand slamming down on the activation lever. The ship lurched forward as the stars blurred into streaks of light, the interceptors vanishing from the radar. They had made it. Ayla let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the controls as the ship stabilized in the quiet safety of hyperspace. Ethan slumped back in his seat, a weary smile tugging at his lips. Not bad, he said, his tone light despite the exhaustion in his voice. Thanks, Ayla replied, her own relief tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. But this is just the beginning. Ethan nodded, his expression turning serious. The governor won't stop, not after what you've done. Let him come, Ayla said, her gaze hardening. This time, we fight together. The ship's engines hummed softly as they hurtled through hyperspace, two souls bound by a shared purpose, and an unshakable resolve to stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. The silence of hyperspace enveloped the ship, a fragile cocoon of safety that felt almost unreal after the chaos they'd just escaped. Ayla leaned back in the pilot's chair, exhaustion settling into her bones like a heavy weight. For a moment, she let her guard down, her gaze drifting to the viewport where streaks of light painted the void. Ethan stirred behind her, the automed unit humming as it completed its work. He stood unsteadily, his movements slow but determined. Don't tell me you're planning to take on the whole syndicate with just this rust bucket and a handful of data. Ayla turned to face him, her expression unreadable. If that's what it takes. Ethan studied her, his brow furrowing. You always did have a death wish. Not a death wish, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Just a need to make things right. He shook his head, a faint smile playing at his lips, despite the gravity of their situation. You know, most people would call this suicidal. But then again, you've never been most people. Ayla allowed herself a small smile in return, but it didn't last. Her focus returned to the console, where she began scanning for safe harbor. The data upload had exposed the governor's corruption, but it had also painted a massive target on their backs. They needed allies, and fast. Where are we headed? Ethan asked, moving to stand beside her. There's a resistance cell operating out of the Lyra 7 asteroid belt, Ayla said, pulling up a star map. They've been fighting the Syndicate's influence for years. If anyone can help us, it's them. Ethan frowned. The Lyra 7 belt is crawling with patrols. You really think they'll risk sheltering us after the stunt you just pulled? They don't have to like us, Ayla said. They just have to hate the governor more. Ethan sighed, his skepticism evident but unspoken. He knew better than to argue when Ayla had that look in her eye, a mix of determination and defiance that could move mountains. The ship dropped out of hyperspace with a jarring lurch, the stars snapping back into place as the asteroid belt came into view. Massive chunks of rock floated in the void, their surfaces glittering with the faint traces of minerals that had made the region a contested territory for decades. Ayla guided the ship carefully, weaving through the dense field of debris and natural formations. She kept the scanners active, watching for signs of life or trouble. As they approached the coordinates she'd pulled from an old resistance contact, a series of red blips appeared on the radar. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, his voice low. "We've got company." Ayla squinted at the display. A small fleet of ships was approaching, their configurations unmistakably hostile. Resistance fighters or opportunistic scavengers. It didn't matter. They weren't here to welcome them with open arms. "This just keeps getting better," Ethan muttered, gripping the back of her chair as the enemy ships closed in. Ayla activated the comms, broadcasting on an open channel. "This is Ayla Tanis, seeking safe harbor. We've got critical intel on the governor's operations. Intel that could turn the tide in your favor." The response was swift and cold. "Identify yourself, or prepare to be fired upon." Ayla gritted her teeth. "I already told you who I am. If you don't want the data I'm carrying, that's your loss. But trust me, you'll regret it." The comms went silent, the tension stretching taut as the enemy ships surrounded them. Then, a new voice broke through. Calm, authoritative, and laced with curiosity. "Ayla Tanis, I've heard of you. The Ceylon warrior who disappeared years ago. If you're lying, I'll personally see to it that you don't live to regret it." Ayla smirked faintly. "Then I guess it's a good thing I'm not lying." There was another pause before the voice returned. "Lower your shields and follow us. Any deviation and you'll be destroyed." Ayla glanced at Ethan, who gave her a resigned shrug. "Not like we've got a choice," he said. She powered down the shields and engines, allowing the resistance ships to escort them deeper into the asteroid belt. They wove through a labyrinth of hidden passages and cloaked outposts, the scale of the operation becoming increasingly clear. Finally, they docked at a massive hollowed-out asteroid, its interior bustling with activity. Fighters darted to and fro, engineers worked on makeshift ships, and the hum of life filled the cavernous space. Ayla and Ethan stepped off their ship, their movements cautious but confident. A group of armed resistance fighters approached, their weapons trained on the newcomers. At their head was a tall, stern-faced woman with piercing green eyes and an air of command. "I'm Commander Lyra," she said, her tone clipped. "You'd better hope what you've brought us is worth the trouble, Tanis." Ayla met her gaze evenly. "It will be. But first, I need to know, are you willing to fight?" Commander Lyra's lips twitched into a faint smile, though her eyes remained hard. "That depends on what you've got to offer." Ayla held up the data drive, its surface glinting under the harsh lights. "Proof of the governor's corruption, names, transactions, and locations, enough to bring his whole operation crashing down." Lyra studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me. Let's see what you've got." Ayla and Ethan followed her through the bustling base, their presence drawing curious and suspicious glances from the resistance fighters. Despite the tension, Ayla felt a flicker of hope. She had taken the first step toward turning the tide, and she wasn't about to back down now. Commander Lyra led Ayla and Ethan through the heart of the resistance base, her sharp eyes scanning their every move. The cavernous interior buzzed with the hum of machinery and the sound of soldiers preparing for battle, each person a cog in the ever-turning wheel of rebellion. Lyra stopped at a large metallic table in the center of a command room where several officers were already gathered. The walls around them were lined with screens, all showing various feeds from across the colony, patrol routes, civilian unrest, and intercepted messages. A map of the governor's territories was projected in the center, marked with red zones of influence. "Show them," Lyra said curtly, gesturing to the data drive. Ayla handed it over, watching closely as Lyra inserted it into a terminal. The room fell silent as the data began to load, the officers exchanging wary glances. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the first file appeared, revealing a list of names. Influential figures within the governor's inner circle, all involved in shady dealings and illegal operations. Lyra's eyes narrowed as the data unfolded before her. This is bigger than I expected." Her voice was low, but charged with an edge of surprise. "How did you get this?" Ayla shifted uneasily but held her ground. "A lot of people are afraid of the governor, and for good reason. He doesn't just control the military, he controls everything. Commerce, communications, even the food supply. But there's a key weakness in his operation." "And you think we can exploit it?" Lyra asked, her tone skeptical. "I know we can," Ayla replied. "We'll need to strike at his financial hub first. His money is the power behind everything. Without it, he'll crumble." Lyra tapped a few buttons on the terminal, bringing up a secure map of the governor's operations, showing hidden vaults, encrypted transport routes, and black market deals. As the data continued to pour in, the full scale of the governor's empire began to reveal itself. "I didn't expect this level of corruption," one of the officers said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "This is not just a regime. It's a dictatorship built on lies and blood." Ayla's eyes darkened. "It's worse than that. This man's influence extends far beyond this sector. He's involved with intergalactic cartels, and he's been buying up entire colonies, one by one." A tense silence followed, as the full weight of Ayla's words settled over the room. Finally, Lyra spoke. "And you want us to lead the charge?" Ayla nodded. "The longer we wait, the more people will suffer. But we can't do this alone." Lyra studied her for a moment, then glanced at her officers. After a moment of deliberation, she turned back to Ayla. "All right, Tanis, I'll give you the support you need. But know this, This mission will cost us. We're not just fighting for freedom. We're fighting to expose the truth. And once the governor knows we're coming for him, there's no turning back. Ayla met her gaze, her voice steady. I'm not backing down. The room hummed with a renewed energy, the officers rallying behind their commander. Ayla could see it now. The spark of rebellion, the beginning of something much larger than a single strike against the governor. This was the beginning of a war they had no choice but to fight. Get ready, Lyra said, her tone firm. We move out in 2 hours. We'll need to gather intel on the governor's financial assets and cut off his supply lines. We'll also need a distraction. She turned to one of her officers. Get in contact with the others. I want every ship we can muster. As the team dispersed to prepare for the operation, Ayla and Ethan stood at the edge of the room. You think we're ready for this? Ethan asked, his voice low. Ayla didn't hesitate. We don't have a choice. We've already crossed the point of no return. But we'll make it. We have to. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I'm with you. To the end. For a moment, Ayla felt the weight of his words. Their bond had been forged in the heat of their past, but now it was something more. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something greater, something worth the cost of everything. The countdown to launch was quick. Ayla and Ethan made their way back to their ship, the steady pulse of the base's engines filling the air. The resistance fighters were gearing up for battle, their movements quick and efficient, the tension palpable. Ayla boarded the ship, her fingers flying over the controls as she initiated the pre-launch sequence. Ethan settled into the co-pilot seat, his eyes scanning the holomap of the governor's stronghold. We've got one shot at this, Ayla said, her voice tight with focus. We hit him where it hurts, and we don't give him a chance to retaliate. Ethan glanced at her, his lips curling into a faint grin. I've been waiting for a chance like this. Let's take him down. The ship's engines roared to life as they launched into the cold expanse of space. Ahead, the governor's stronghold loomed like a dark monolith, its presence a constant reminder of the tyranny they were about to face. But for the first time in years, Ayla felt a flicker of hope. They were no longer running. They were no longer hiding. They were about to strike back, and this time, they wouldn't stop until the governor's empire was nothing but a smoldering ruin. The battle for freedom had begun. The silence of space stretched out before them, broken only by the hum of the engines and the rapid-fire clicking of the console as Ayla and Ethan prepared for their final strike. The governor's fortress loomed large on the view screen, a sprawling, fortified station surrounded by layers of defense. Every inch of it was designed to repel invaders, to reinforce the illusion of invulnerability. Ayla's fingers moved with practiced precision across the ship's controls. Approaching target zone. Get ready, she said, her voice steady, but beneath it, a current of anticipation crackled. Ethan's eyes flickered to the tactical readout. Sensors are picking up heavy patrols. They know we're coming. His voice carried a tinge of excitement, though his gaze remained hard. Ready for this? Always, she replied, focusing on the task ahead. The ship shook slightly as they hit the perimeter, a barrage of laser fire lighting up the darkness around them. Ayla veered sharply, the ship twisting and diving to avoid the incoming fire. The resistance ships had already begun their assault, launching waves of counterattacks to divert the governor's fleet. But the real challenge lay ahead. A massive armored hangar bay came into view, one of the few unshielded entrances into the heart of the station. The path ahead was clear, but only for a moment. This is it. Once we're in, we won't have much time before they lock everything down, Ayla said. She glanced at Ethan. You ready? Ethan's gaze was unwavering. You're the one who made the plan. With a sharp maneuver, Ayla dove into the hangar bay, the ship's landing gear scraping against the cold metal of the station floor as they skidded into place. The sound of alarms blared instantly, but it didn't matter. They were here now. The hatch opened with a hiss, and Ayla drew her blaster, moving quickly down the ramp. The station was eerily quiet, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. They had only moments before reinforcements arrived. Ayla and Ethan moved fast, navigating the maze of hallways that would lead them to the governor's inner sanctum. The map they had stolen was invaluable, but time was against them. As they passed through corridors and sealed doors, the gravity of their mission sank in. This wasn't just about survival. It was about stopping a man who had cast a shadow over entire systems, and now, the light was beginning to burn through that darkness. "Almost there," Ayla said, as the door to the governor's central command room loomed ahead. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the undeniable certainty that this was the moment they'd been waiting for. The door slid open, revealing the governor seated at his desk, the vast windows behind him looking out over the sprawling station. His face twisted into a sneer as he stood, his voice cold and venomous. "You really think you can take me down, Tanis?" he said. "You and your pathetic little band of rebels?" Ayla stepped forward, blaster in hand. "No, I know we can." Before he could respond, the resistance forces stormed into the room, weapons drawn. The governor's guards were quickly subdued, and the rest of his loyalists either fled or surrendered. But the governor wasn't done yet. He reached beneath his desk, triggering a hidden alarm. A massive mechanical door slammed down behind them, cutting off their exit. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. But Ayla wasn't worried. She'd prepared for this. "Move!" she shouted to Ethan, and within seconds he was by her side, firing at the controls to the main door. Sparks flew, the mechanism groaning as it began to malfunction. Ayla took cover as a hail of gunfire rang out from the governor's remaining troops. The room erupted into chaos as blaster fire lit up the space, ricocheting off the walls, and the echoes of combat reverberated through the station. Ayla felt a pulse of adrenaline surge through her veins. This was it. She turned back to the governor, who was desperately reaching for another weapon, a final resort. But it was too late. With a single decisive shot, she ended his reign of terror. As the governor crumpled to the floor, the station seemed to sigh. Its weight lifted, its oppressive hold finally broken. The resistance fighters who had followed them in began to secure the area, binding the remaining traitors and ensuring no one could stop the victory they had worked so hard to achieve. Ayla stood over the fallen governor, breathing heavily, her heart still pounding with the thrill of the moment. It was over. But this victory was only the beginning. There would be more to fight for, more to rebuild, more to heal. The governor's death would send ripples through the galaxy, but it was the people who would define the future now. Ethan walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice soft, yet proud. Ayla nodded, her gaze lifting to the now quiet command center. "We did it." Outside, the stars twinkled against the vastness of space. The galaxy was a little less dark than it had been just hours before, a little more hopeful. And as Ayla stepped out of the command room, her steps light, her heart filled with purpose, she knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than herself. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they had a chance to win. And that was enough. If you've enjoyed this journey with Ayla and Ethan, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling adventures. Your support keeps the stories alive.